Chess openings are a battle of known strategic ideas. And the next opening we will look at, called the Nimzo-Indian defense, is a prime example of this clash of strategic ideas. It begins with the moves pawn to d4, and unlike the other openings that we've looked at, where black plays pawn to d5, he begins with knight to f6, attacking the e4 square, preventing white from immediately pushing the pawn to e4. White continues with pawn to c4. And now black plays pawn to e6, opening up this dark squared bishop for an immediate check. And white continues with knight to c3. And the bishop pinning the knight signifies the Nimzo-Indian defense. Because of this pin, white still can't push the pawn to e4, which he was threatening to do when he played his knight to c3. In open positions, that is, positions where the bishops are not blocked by their own or enemy pawns, especially through the center, having both bishops, or the bishop pair as it is called in chess, is considered a strategic advantage in the hands of skilled players. But in the Nimzo-Indian, black is willing to give white the bishop pair by capturing the knight at c3 here in exchange for rapid development of his pieces and a closed center which will favor his knights. If white wants to go into this line, he provokes the bishop into capturing the knight, which is called the Zamish variation. Pawn takes back the bishop. And the other advantage that black has now are the weak pawns along the c-file, the c4 pawn and the c3 pawn. White is willing to accept this positional weakness and delayed development in the hopes of later using his bishops to dominate black's knights. There are several other ways that white can play the position after bishop to b4. He can play e3, which is called the Rubinstein system. Or he can play queen to c2, which is the Capablanca variation. Or you can play knight to f3, which is called the three knights or Kasparov variation. Or he can play f3, which is called the Kamach variation. Or he can even play bishop to g5, which is called the Leningrad variation. So as you can see, the Nimzo-Indian is rich in possibilities, which makes it a very popular opening. Now let's look at a couple of games and see how the strategic ideas of the Nimzo-Indian play out. Okay, let's look at this game from the black side, since it is a black defense. The game starts out d4, knight to f6, preventing e4, pawn to c4, e6, letting the bishop out, knight to c3, preventing the immediate check, also threatening to push e4 to get a really big center. But the bishop stops that with a pin, and white immediately provokes the bishop to decide what to do. And he takes it, and now black has achieved the goals that we talked about earlier with the Nimzo-Indian, the doubled pawns, the weak pawns. And white chips away here at the center and wants to get his knight out with the pawn advanced. Bishop to d3, b6, letting the bishop out, and he advances, and he stops this threat. The pawn could push here and chase the knight away because of the support of this pawn. Now he stops that because there are two pieces on this square now. The knight's defending that square. Knight swings out this way. Okay. And now black goes on the offensive. He's attacking this pawn. It's defended once by the bishop, but he can easily start doubling up on it with the bishop here. And it kind of ties the queen down. The knight could pop in here, threatening the rook and the bishop. Castles. Now he's got two attackers on this pawn, knight and bishop. The knight defends. Rook slides over. Now there's a possible threat here. Two attackers. There's an X-ray on this pawn, the c4 pawn. White harasses the knight. Pawn takes. Pawn takes. Knight swings back, attacking the pawn. Pawn advances, defending the pawn. And black, wow, black doesn't mess around here. Black's saying, okay, I'm going to stop your counterplay over here on the king side, and we'll try and beat you over here on the queen side with your bad pawns and through the center. And black captures en passant. Knight takes. White wants to keep the position open, allow his bishops to do their best. Queen attacks the pawn, and black will let white capture that pawn if he wants. Does he? No, he develops instead. Okay, so this is a side point in terms of development, which we talked about earlier. You know, white still hadn't developed his bishop. This rook is doing nothing, whereas black has his pieces out, and there's compensation. If he takes the pawn, the king would have to run, and that would be a check. But then this bishop is undefended, so black gets some initiative where white's going to have to run around a lot defending. For example, let's say white decides to take the pawn with check. The king runs, and now you see black is ready to attack the queen. So the queen runs back. This is just one scenario, but this bishop was undefended. See, notice the bishop needs to be defended. So the queen runs back. The rook attacks it. The queen runs again. And now the bishop can work on this pawn, as I mentioned. Say this pawn moves to allow this bishop to do something useful. It can come over here and pin the knight. But he's still a little behind. You see black got some momentum for the extra tempos he got when white captured that pawn. So now he can grab that pawn. Say bishop takes, because there were two attackers on this bishop. Queen and bishop. Bishop takes, trades. Knight takes. Now let's say the bishop goes in with the pin so he can develop his pieces. You see he was behind in development from all of this. His pieces need to get active. But you see black is still ahead in this initiative here. So he attacks, he creates a fork here between the queen and the rook. So the bishop has to go back and take the knight. And now the rook takes. So you see how much momentum black got after that capture. Perhaps with perfect play this is still okay for white, but he still has these bad pawns, so he's a little reluctant to go down that line because there's just too much to calculate and the future was unclear. So instead he develops and says, I'm not going to grab that pawn. I don't want that sort of compensation. Allow you to have that initiative on the attack. Now the queen defends the pawn, but also preparing perhaps to power up over here. There's a mate threat here. Queen here, supported by the bishop. Rook slides over, putting two, X-raying the pawn, two attackers on the pawn. Now the queen does power up over here, forms a battery. The rook defends this mating square. The rook defends this mating square, gives some support to the queen, allows the queen to move. Rook gets into the action on the open file, attacking the bishop. White opens up a square here, attacking the pawn, allowing this bishop to become more active along the diagonal. And black slides over, X-raying the queen. White takes, rook takes. Now this is pinned. He attacks the rook. Rook slides up, attacking the bishop. Here we have again the maneuvering. See who's going to outplay the opponent. Bishop runs back, defending this pawn again. The rooks double up on this file now, x-raying the queen and the rook. Queen gets out of that. And the bishop slides over to a6. Two attackers on this pawn. There's nothing he can do. Black's pieces are very active. And as you can see, he's achieved the goal of the Nimzo-Indian, and that is to create the bad pawns, go after them, win them. And actually, white resigned here. Perhaps it was premature here, but sometimes players just don't want to struggle when they have a clear disadvantage and nothing to work with. Not something most chess teachers would recommend, however. It's usually good policy to just keep fighting until the bitter end. Try and create problems for your opponent, because there are countless games that players have turned around simply by hanging tough. Because as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over.